I used to think love in your 60s was supposed to be softer. Gentle mornings, slow dances, shared coffee by the window. After losing my husband, I never thought I'd feel that warmth again. Until I met Frank. He made me laugh like I hadn't in years. We talked about growing old together, traveling, and building a little house by the lake. Our forever home, he called it. I poured every bit of my savings into that dream. Every nail, every brick, every soft color on the walls. But forever came with fine print. When I found out only his name was on the mortgage, it was like the air left my lungs. I wasn't his partner anymore, just another woman who believed too much. I could have walked away quietly, but something inside me, the part that built that home with my hands, decided not to. When I met Frank Turner, I wasn't looking for love. I wasn't even sure I believed in it anymore. I was 62, a widow for almost 10 years, and I'd built a quiet, simple life in Asheville. My days were filled with small routines, a morning walk with my coffee mug in hand, volunteering at the local library, and weekend calls with my daughter, who lived 3 hours away in Raleigh. It wasn't a bad life, just a quiet one, the kind of quiet that sometimes felt heavy around the edges. Frank came into my world on an ordinary afternoon, at the hardware store of all places. I remember standing there, staring at a wall of paint samples, debating between 2 shades of blue from my front door. He walked up beside me, pointed at one, and said, "That one looks like it belongs to someone who smiles a lot." I laughed, a real laugh, not the polite kind. He had that way about him, easy charm, a warm, steady voice, the kind that makes you feel like you've known the person longer than you actually have. He told me he was a retired contractor. "Built more homes than I can count," he said proudly. He was there to pick up materials for a project he was helping with at his church. That same day, we ended up talking for almost half an hour right there in the aisle, about the mountains, about how winters in Asheville could be both beautiful and lonely. He mentioned his wife had passed a few years back, cancer. I nodded quietly and told him I knew what that kind of silence felt like. For a moment, we both stood there. 2 people who had been through the same kind of loss, just breathing in it together. We started having coffee after that. First at the little diner off Merriman Avenue, then later at the bakery near my house. It became our thing. Saturday mornings, coffee and cinnamon rolls, and stories that stretched into the afternoon. He had this gentle confidence, the kind that made me feel like I could lean on someone again. We didn't rush anything. It just unfolded. Naturally, softly, the way second chances sometimes do when you least expect them. Frank loved to dream. He talked about travel, about building something meaningful, about leaving behind a place that felt alive. I remember one morning, over coffee, he looked at me and said, "You know, Claire, we should build something together. A home that's ours, not haunted by old memories." At first, I laughed it off. "I don't need anything big, Frank," I told him. "I've got everything I need right where I am." But he had that look, that hopeful glint in his eyes. "It's not about big," he said. "It's about starting fresh, about peace." Over the next few months, that idea began to take root. We started driving out to the lake on weekends, a quiet little spot about 40 minutes outside town, surrounded by pine trees and open sky. The water there had a stillness to it, the kind that made you feel like time slowed down. Every time we went, I found myself imagining mornings on the porch, watching the fog lift off the water. It sounded peaceful, and for someone who had lived with ghosts of the past for years, peace felt like a promise. When Frank showed me the land, a small clearing just off the road, with a view of the lake through the trees, I could already picture it. "Our forever home," he called it, his voice soft but sure. I smiled at the words, our. It had been a long time since I'd felt that kind of belonging in someone's plans. I used the money I had left from my husband's life insurance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover my share of what Frank said we'd need to start the build. He insisted we do things right, hire good people, make it a place we could both be proud of. And I trusted him, completely. He handled the contractors, the materials, the schedules. I handled the little things, choosing paint colors, furniture, curtains. We spent weekends driving to antique shops, picking out pieces for our future. I remember holding his hand as we walked through one old furniture store and thinking how strange it felt to feel so certain about something again at my age. Every evening I'd stop by the site after work. The smell of fresh wood, the sound of hammers echoing through the hills. It was like watching a dream rise out of the dirt. Frank would stand beside me, his arm around my shoulders, talking about where the porch swing would go, how we'd hang fairy lights along the edge of the deck. He'd say, "You see that view, Claire? That's the one we'll grow old looking at." And I believed him, every word. There was this one night, near the end of construction, that still lingers in my memory. We stood by the lake, watching the reflection of our new home's lights shimmer across the water. He handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You know, I think we've earned this." I smiled and said, "Feels like we built more than a house, doesn't it?" He nodded. We built a life. That night I felt safe. I remember running my fingers along the new wooden railing, feeling the smoothness of it under my palm, thinking, this is what love looks like when you're older. Steady, quiet, sure. The house wasn't grand, but it was perfect for us. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a porch that wrapped around the front. I picked a soft cream for the walls and a pale green for the shutters. It was warm and welcoming, the kind of place that seemed to breathe with you. Every detail carried a piece of me. The curtains I sewed myself, the rocking chair I'd brought from my old home, the quilt on the couch my mother had made years ago. It felt personal, honest, ours. I remember the day we moved in. The sun was shining, the air smelled like pine and paint. I stood in the middle of the living room, boxes still unopened, and whispered, "We did it." Frank smiled, walked up behind me, and kissed the top of my head. "You see, Claire? You were right to believe again." It's strange, looking back now, how perfect that moment felt. How the quietest parts of your life can hold the biggest illusions. A few weeks after moving in, I decided to repaint the front porch. The original color was too dark, too heavy. I wanted something lighter, something that reflected the peace I thought I'd found. I spent the afternoon out there, in my old jeans and a paint-splattered shirt, the lake breeze brushing against my face. Frank was in town, running errands, and the radio played softly beside me. Some old country song about home and heartache. I remember stepping back to look at my work, smiling at how fresh it looked. The boards glowed pale gold under the setting sun. I could almost see the future in that moment. Quiet mornings, laughter echoing through the house, the 2 of us sitting on that porch watching the seasons change. That was the thing about hope. It always looks brightest right before it breaks. As the light faded, I sat down on the steps, brush still in hand, and watched the lake turn silver under the dusk. The sound of crickets filled the air, and somewhere in the distance, a loon called out across the water. It was peaceful, too peaceful to ever imagine what was coming. I remember whispering to myself, "This is it, Claire. You've finally found home again." And in that soft, golden light, I truly believed it. I didn't know that the home I had poured my heart and my savings into wasn't really mine. That the papers Frank promised to handle were already setting the stage for a kind of heartbreak I never thought I'd face again. But that moment on the porch, it still lives in my memory as the last time I felt completely safe. The paint was still drying when I heard his truck coming up the gravel drive. He waved from the window, smiling, calling out, "Looks perfect, sweetheart." And I smiled back, paintbrush still in hand, never realizing that the house behind me, the one I built with love, already belonged to someone else. That evening, we sat on that same porch, coffee mugs in hand, talking about plans for the garden, maybe adding a small dock down by the water. I remember laughing, feeling that easy comfort that only comes from trust. The stars began to appear overhead, and he reached for my hand, saying softly, "We did good, didn't we?" And I said yes. I said it without hesitation, because sometimes when you've lost so much already, you'll believe in anything that feels like home, and that's exactly what I thought I'd built with. Frank, a forever home, but forever has a way of ending before you even realize it's begun. I used to think that after the hardest years of your life, the rest would come easy. I thought that once you'd known grief, life would go soft on you. Gentle, patient, forgiving. For a while it even felt that way. The house was finished, and every morning I'd wake to sunlight spilling through the kitchen window, the scent of pine from the lake drifting in through the screen door. It felt like the start of something new. Frank was in his element then. Busy, confident, proud. He'd walk through the house, running his hands over the walls, saying things like, "We did good, Claire. This place has heart." And I'd smile because he was right. We had done good. I had poured every bit of my love, my time, and what savings I had into it. It wasn't just a home. It was a promise, a second chance at peace. One morning, about a week before we were set to move everything in, Frank showed up with a folder tucked under his arm. He smiled the way he always did when he had something planned. "You know, sweetheart," he said, laying the folder on the kitchen table, "we should probably go ahead and get the paperwork finished before we get too settled. Just to keep things neat and clean for the bank. I'll handle most of it. You just need to sign in a few spots." I remember tilting my head, half curious. "You sure you don't need me to look it over?" I asked. "You know I'm not the best with all that legal talk." He chuckled and kissed the top of my head. "That's exactly why I'm doing it, Claire. You've done enough, decorating, picking everything out. Let me take care of this. You trust me, right?" And I did, without hesitation. I'd spent months watching him build our dream with his own 2 hands. Trusting him had become second nature. He'd talk about protecting me, making sure everything would be smooth sailing if anything ever happened. Those words, "if anything ever happened," stuck with me. They sounded caring then. They'd sound different later. He spread the papers out on the table, flipping through them with practiced ease. "Just a few signatures," he said, pointing to the lines. "The mortgage company needs both of us to sign off for insurance purposes. It's all standard procedure." I glanced at the first page. Dense paragraphs, numbers, and terms I didn't really understand. I remember thinking how small and confusing legal documents always looked, like they were designed to make you give up and just trust whoever was holding the pen. So I did. I signed where he told me. Each pen stroke felt simple, harmless. He smiled after each one, murmuring things like, "Perfect," and "That's my girl." When it was done, he slid the papers neatly back into the folder. "All taken care of," he said. "Now we can enjoy our home without any of that messy red tape." That night we celebrated. I made roasted chicken and baked potatoes, and he brought home a bottle of wine, the kind I always said was too expensive. We ate on the porch, the lake glowing under the moonlight. Frank raised his glass and said, "To us, and to our forever home." I smiled and said it back. I meant it. Life settled into a rhythm after that. Morning walks together, dinners at the same table, quiet evenings watching the fire crackle. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at the house, proud, satisfied, like a man who'd built not just a home but a whole life around it. And for a while, I was happy to think that's exactly what we had. My daughter Emily came by often. She lived about an hour away, and always brought her boys, my grandsons, who filled the place with noise and laughter. She'd hug me and say, "Mom, I'm glad you found someone. You look peaceful again." And I was. Or at least I thought I was. Still, every so often, small things would flicker in the corner of my mind. Things I brushed off at the time. One evening, while we were having coffee after dinner, I mentioned maybe updating my will now that I had a new home. It might be smart to put both our names on it, just to make things easier, I said casually. Frank's smile faltered for just a second. He looked down at his cup, then back up with that same easy charm. "No need to worry about that yet," he said lightly. "We'll cross that bridge later. You've already done enough paperwork to last a lifetime. I nodded, though something about the way he said it didn't sit right. But then he changed the subject, made me laugh about something trivial, and the unease passed. Another time, I noticed the mail piling up on his desk. A few envelopes from the bank, some from the insurance company. When I asked if we needed to review anything, he brushed it off again. Just the usual, interest statements and junk mail. You know how they are. Then he'd smile, take the stack, and slip it into a drawer. He had this way of making everything sound fine, so reasonable, so casual. And I wanted to believe it. I didn't want to be suspicious, not after everything we'd built together. Trust is a funny thing. Once you've given it, you don't want to look too closely at it, afraid you'll see the cracks. But cracks have a way of widening when you're not paying attention. It started one Friday afternoon. I was cleaning the kitchen when the mail arrived. Bills, catalogs, the usual. But there was one envelope from the bank. Thick paper, official-looking. I wiped my hands and opened it without thinking. Inside was a statement addressed to Mr. Frank Turner. Just him, no mention of me anywhere. My stomach sank. It wasn't just a casual letter when it was a mortgage statement. I flipped through the pages, scanning for my name, thinking maybe it was just a clerical mistake. But it wasn't. The entire document, the loan, the insurance, the title, all listed Frank as the sole borrower and owner. I remember standing there in the kitchen, frozen. The house around me suddenly felt different, quieter, almost foreign. When Frank came home that evening, I was still holding the letter. He smiled when he saw me, but paused when he noticed the envelope in my hand. "What's that?" he asked, his voice a little too casual. "A letter from the bank," I said softly. "Why is it only addressed to you?" He looked at me for a long moment, then shrugged. "Oh, that? It's just a formality, Claire. You know how banks are. They can only list one primary contact. It's all in both our names, don't worry." But something in his tone, that subtle edge, that quickness to explain, made my heart skip. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Because my name isn't anywhere on this." His jaw tightened. "Claire, please," he said a little sharper now. "You're overthinking again. You signed everything. It's fine. Just let me handle it." And just like that, the conversation was over. He took the letter from my hand, folded it neatly, and placed it in the drawer with the others. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening to the sound of the clock ticking in the living room, each second stretching longer than the one before. The house I had helped build, the home I'd painted, decorated and dreamed inside, suddenly felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets. I tried to push the thought away, but it kept returning. Why wasn't my name there? The next morning, over breakfast, Frank acted as if nothing had happened. He was cheerful, humming, talking about fixing the fence out back. I watched him move around the kitchen, every motion so confident, so practiced, and I couldn't help but wonder how many times he'd done this, not fixing fences, but fixing lies. It's strange how quickly doubt can change the way you see someone. One moment, they're the person you trust most in the world. The next, every smile, every gesture feels rehearsed. I didn't confront him again that day. Or the day after, but inside something had shifted. The warmth I used to feel when he spoke was gone, replaced by quiet questions I didn't yet know how to ask. The days went on like that, still polite, pretending everything was fine. But the truth had already found its way in, and even though I didn't know it yet, that letter was just the beginning of everything that would come undone. Rachel's visit that week was supposed to be ordinary, just a weekend stop between her work shifts, a chance to bring the boys over for pancakes and let them run around on the lawn while we sat on the porch and traded small talk. She'd called Friday evening and said she had a free Saturday and wanted to help me get the office sorted, the way she always did because she knew I hated crouching over stacks of papers. I said yes without thinking. Organizing boxes felt like the kind of small, sensible work that would make the house feel more like a home. When she arrived, she hugged me hard, the way daughters do. quick and practical. A hug that says, "I'm here." The boys tumbled out of the back seat, sticky fingers and loud laughter, and immediately claimed the porch swing as their throne. Rachel and I carried boxes into the little study off the kitchen and spread everything out on the floor. Instruction manuals, receipts, warranty booklets, and the folder I had trusted to Frank, the one he'd promised he'd handle. We made a game of it. At first, stack like with like, toss what's useless, make labels. Rachel found a roll of stickers and insisted we slap urgent on anything that looked official. She teased me about my handwriting and told me I needed to let her park her color-coded system on my life. The afternoon sun came in through the window, and dust motes danced like tiny planets around us. For a while it felt normal, warm, the kind of ordinary I'd learned to love again. Then she pulled a thin envelope from the bottom of the folder and froze. I remember the sound the room made. The boys cheering outside, a dog barking down the lane, the slow hum of the refrigerator. Everything became a background to the small paper in her hands. She unfolded it carefully like something fragile. Her face changed from playful to puzzled to suddenly very still. "Mom," she said, and it was like a stone rolled across the table between us. "Is this the mortgage paperwork?" I laughed it off, the nervous little laugh you do when you think it's a joke or a clerical error. "Must be," I said. "Why?" "Did they put giant neon letters on it?" She turned the pages, and the color left her face. "Mom, your name isn't on this anywhere." Her voice wasn't loud. It was the kind of low sound that sounded like disbelief and worry wrapped together. I took the papers from her hands because my brain, for some reason, decided the correct response was movement. I ran my finger over the bold print, the legalese that you don't read until you have to, and then I found it. The loan agreement, the promissory note, the deed, all in his name. Frank Turner, sole owner, no mention of Claire Bennett. No mention of any account or account holder that resembled my name. For a moment, nothing made sense. The floor tilted slightly like the little boat I used to take out on the lake when the water was calm. I could hear Rachel breathe behind me. The boys were still arguing over who could sit in the swing. Their voices sounded small and distant. I read the pages again, as if repetition could stitch the missing words back into the document. But the truth doesn't hide better with reading. The truth sat there, plain and terrible. "Maybe it's a different folder," I said, because my mouth wanted to buy time. "Maybe there's another set of papers." Rachel was quiet. She folded the papers back and laid them on the table with a gentleness I would later remember like a benediction. "Mom, I don't think so," she said. "This is the title for the property at the lake. It's all listed to Frank Turner." A heat rose in my throat that had nothing to do with anger, at least at first. It was more like vertigo, a sudden drop in the stomach that made my knees want to buckle. I thought the porch I painted, the kitchen tiles, the quilt on the couch, the little garden he promised he'd help plant. All paid for with my savings, all built with my hands, all signed over to a name that wasn't mine. I remember sitting down slowly on the old wooden chair like someone making a bad decision, and for a long moment I couldn't find the right words. The boys bounced in on the moment, followed by their small dust-scattered shoes, and Rachel put a hand on my shoulder without a fuss. "We'll figure this out," she said, like it was that simple, as if a daughter's faith could smooth every jagged edge. "Maybe it's just a mistake," I said finally. "Maybe the bank put the wrong name on. He said he'd take care of things. He was doing the paperwork. Maybe he filled it out wrong." Rachel didn't laugh. Instead, she rose, went to the window, and stared out toward the lane as if the trees could whisper the answer. "Mom," she said after a long breath, "we should call the bank. We should ask for copies of what you signed, for your records." The call to the bank was the kind of small official thing that suddenly feels enormous. The woman on the other end of the line had the patient tone of someone who sees messy lives on paper all the time. She asked for account numbers, social security numbers, and then said, "According to our records, the mortgage is in Mr. Frank Turner's name. There's an address associated with it, and the primary contact is Mr. Turner. She used the words like she was reading the weather. Factual, without malice. Rachel stayed the night. The boys slept on the couch, tangled among blankets. We didn't talk much after they went to bed. We made tea and sat on the porch, letting the night settle around us like a soft blanket. The air smelled of wet leaves and something like old wood and paint. I kept looking at the house the way you look at a painting after you've been told some secret about the subject. The lovely brush strokes didn't disappear. They just seemed different. The next morning I asked Frank about it. I thought maybe he'd laugh, or perhaps apologize, say something about a clerical mistake. When he walked in from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag, I held the papers out like a mirror. "Frank," I said, "Rachel found the loan documents. My name isn't on any of it." He put the rag down slowly, his smile practiced and immediate like someone handing you a lifeline. "Oh, Claire," he said, casual, almost tender, "you signed the mortgage application. That's what matters. The bank often makes the documents out in the primary borrower's name. It's all under control." His voice soothed like honey poured over stone, and for a startling second I wanted to believe again. He stepped closer, reached for my hand. "Don't be dramatic," he added in the same soft voice, the words a practiced balm. "It's all ours, aren't you happy? We built this together." He squeezed my fingers as if to prove it. There was a coolness to his words I felt then, a varnish that didn't quite cover what I was holding in my hand. I looked down at the signatures on the paper, his sharp, clear name, repeated like a stamp across the pages. My signature was nowhere. My name was a ghost in the house we had built together. Anger came next, but it was a small, controlled thing at first. The shock had left my mind too numb for outrage. Synapses that should have sparked were swimming in syrup. I asked straightforward questions. What did I sign? Where's the application you had me sign? Which parts needed my signature and why isn't my name on the title? He explained with a smoothness that was almost surgical. It was part of the mortgage process. I took care of the title paperwork so you wouldn't have to worry. You signed some consent forms, insurance waivers. Trust me, Claire, there's nothing to worry about. It was his tone, perhaps more than the words, that made my skin prickle. Trust me. The phrase had the weight of 100 small deceptions when placed on someone who already trusted. I wanted to ask if he'd spoken with a lawyer, if any legal counsel had been given, if the documents bore initials or explanations. He seemed offended by the questions, as if my worry had offended him. "You're overreacting," he said, sharper than before. "This is what adults do. We handle things. I'll sort it out. Just let me do my job." Rachel watched from the doorway. She didn't say much, but the set of her jaw told me she didn't like the answer. She'd always had that look. The blend of practical worry and fierce protectiveness that makes mothers and daughters both good at storms. She stepped forward and folded her arms. "Mom," she said, "I don't like trusting him with this alone. Can I see the forms you signed? Did you sign anything naming him as sole owner?" He hesitated then, a small human flicker in the steel of his calm. "It's handled, Rachel," he said. "There's nothing there for you to worry about." The boys were in the next room, playing with a truck, and the soft click of their toys masked the way the world felt like it was cracking. I could feel myself unspooling, the cozy domestic fabric of our life loosening at the seams. There's a particular kind of betrayal that's not loud. It's the quiet footstep behind you in the dark, the small, sly removal of a piece that made your life whole. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't storm out. I didn't make a scene. I sat down, and I listened to the practiced comfort of a man who'd made it an art to sound reasonable. After he left for the town to talk to the bank, I called my lawyer friend, a woman who'd once helped my late husband with small business paperwork. I needed someone to read the papers, to tell me if the language looked ordinary or if there were traps disguised as normality. Her voice on the other end of the line was immediate. "Bring it to me, Claire. We'll go through it line by line." There was a kindness in that voice that felt like a steadying hand on the small of my back. That night, I lay awake listening to the house breathe, an old house settling into its night. The curtains I'd chosen swayed slightly in the breeze, and the lamp on the bedside table cast a familiar pool of amber. Yet the bed felt unfamiliar, as if the mattress had been reupholstered with someone else's logic. My hands had scrubbed paint from the railing that afternoon. The scent of turpentine lingered like a flash of memory. I rolled onto my side and looked at the window at the dark strip of lake beyond. The moon lay like a coin on the water. I thought about every small decision that led me here. The choice of curtains, the late-night phone call when he promised he'd handle the bank, the trust that had seemed natural because of his hands, because he'd built things with his hands, because he'd kiss me like a man steady enough to be trusted. I thought about the way love can be a kind of soft blindness, how it asks you to look only at the light and not at the ledger. Sleep came in fits and starts. When it did come, it brought dreams of walls that walked away and porches that folded like paper. I woke early, the dawn bright and insistent. The house around me was quiet, but a quiet that no longer meant comfort. It meant waiting. In the morning I made a list. It was the practical thing to do. Call the bank, speak to the attorney, gather copies of everything, ask Rachel to stay until we had answers. The list made me feel less like someone adrift and more like someone taking the first few steps toward a plan. There's a strange clarity that pain brings, a sharpening of the senses. That night I had been broken open. By morning, something else had begun to grow inside me. Not revenge, not yet. Not even strength fully formed. Just a small, steady resolve that I would not be swept away by a life I had paid for and helped to build. The house stood out there in the early light, chimney and porch and the pale green shutters I'd chosen. It looked like a photograph, perfect from a distance. Up close, I could see the handprints on the banister where I'd sanded and stained, the little nick in the corner of the kitchen table my grandson had made with a toy truck. It was my house in the smallest truths, and yet the paper that claimed it read otherwise. I wrapped a cup of coffee between my hands and thought about how to hold the two truths together: the home I loved, and the paper that named someone else as its owner. I felt like an archaeologist of my own life, dusting away decades of trust to see what secrets lay beneath. The work would be slow. The work would be careful. But I had already learned one thing. The hands that build can also fight to reclaim what they've made. The weeks after Rachel found the papers felt like walking through fog. Some mornings I would wake and reach for Frank beside me out of habit, and the absence of certainty would press into my chest like a hand. We tried at first to keep the ordinary rhythms. Grocery runs, coffee at the diner, the way he'd chop wood with patience and precision when the stove needed kindling. But ordinary doesn't stitch itself back together when trust loosens at the seams. I remember the afternoon I finally said the words out loud, the way a wound waits for the right moment to open. We were in the kitchen. The light was soft through the curtains, and the radio hummed a low country song, and I had the mortgage papers spread across the table. Rachel had been over in the morning, had made copies and left me with a plan. Call the bank again, get certified records, speak to a lawyer. She'd left with the boys waving, insisting they'd be back on Sunday. The house felt suspiciously quiet, as if it knew I was about to choose a new weather. Frank came in from the garage wiping his hands, the smell of sawdust on his shirt, the routine look of someone who had always built things and believed in the solidity of his own hands. I handed him the copy of the title and sat down. My palms were steady. I don't know where that steadiness came from, except maybe from some older part of me that had learned to steady myself in hospital corridors, during nights when machines kept time and humans needed more than illusions. "Frank," I said, "we need to fix the paperwork. My name should be on the title. I put the money in. I signed documents. I don't want any confusion about ownership." His eyes slid over the page, and for a heartbeat I saw what I had seen before. The practiced man who could make problems feel smaller with a joke or a smile. Then the joke calcified into something harder. "Claire," he said slowly, like someone choosing their words on purpose. "What are you doing?" "You signed the mortgage forms. That's what you needed to do. The bank has it all in order. This is grown-up stuff you don't need to worry about." I felt something inside me flatten. A small, familiar ache of being dismissed. Frank, this isn't about the bank saying so. It's about my name being on the house. I put my savings into this. It should be mine, too. He set the rag down on the counter and leaned in with that same calm that had once comforted me. But his calm had edges now. Claire, please, he said, and the please was a thin veneer over impatience. You're making mountains out of molehills. You don't understand how mortgages work. Let me handle it. There was a tone in his voice I hadn't heard before, one that suggested he considered me a child more than a partner. The anger that rose in me at that moment surprised me. Not a wild flare, but a slow, steady heat that told me I had to answer for myself. This isn't about understanding, I said. It's about respect. You promised it would be ours. I want to make sure the paperwork reflects that. He laughed then, a soft, cruel little sound that slid off the kitchen tiles. Respect? Claire, you've done the decorating and the paint. You've made this place pretty. Let a man handle the messy parts. You've been through a lot. I'm trying to protect you. Protect me. The word landed like a small stone. I could feel the pity in it, like a blanket thrown over a wound instead of stitching it. The more I pressed, the more defensive he grew. When I asked to see the original documents I'd signed, he pushed back harder, made the conversation about my nerves, my age, insinuating I'd misread lines and misremembered conversations. That was when the small heat turned into a bright, sharp thing. I am not a child, I said, and my voice surprised us both by its quiet. I paid for this house. I deserve to be on the title. This isn't about paperwork. It's about truth. He stood up abruptly then, the chair scraping back loud in the quiet kitchen. You're being ridiculous, he snapped, and the word cut clean. I don't need to explain myself to you. This is my livelihood, Claire. You're making this harder than it needs to be. He shoved past me toward the back door like someone trying to push the world away. I watched him go. The back of his shirt stained faintly with oil and sawdust, and for a moment I felt the familiar cold of someone leaving a room for good. He returned within the hour, terse and precise, and said he'd call the bank while I would tidy up. His voice had become a machine of efficiency, and the warmth I'd leaned on had turned to a tool to wipe a surface clean. That night, I packed a small bag of things, photographs, a favorite sweater, the quilt my mother had sewn, thinking absurdly that if there was to be a bad ending, I might need to leave quickly. I didn't go. I stayed and watched the porch light flicker on and off as if the house couldn't decide whether to be welcoming or alarmed. I tried to sleep, but the bed felt too wide and the comforter too thin against the pressing questions. I thought about the woman I had been before grief hollowed certain parts of me. The woman who had learned how to stand upright in hospital corridors, who had learned to say, "Next," when the room demanded motion. That woman was quiet but not broken. I told myself to breathe. The next day, I ran to the grocery store while the town was wrapped in the bright light of early afternoon. The boys had been in school and Rachel had gone to work. The noise of the week was a familiar hum. The store was crowded with the usual neighbors. One of Frank's old church friends at the deli, a woman from my knitting circle browsing the produce. It felt ordinary in a way that made my chest ache with longing for the ordinary to hold. When I returned, the lane to our house seemed the same, the dog next door barking at its fence, the hydrangeas still heavy with bloom. But the moment I stepped up to the porch, I saw it. The locks were different. New steel on the knob that caught the afternoon light like a foreign coin. My key, the one I'd carried for years, slid uselessly in my palm. Boxes sat by the steps, my things in cardboard, my favorite mug toppled, the quilt bundled and tied. Someone had been methodical in packing, methodical in making absence feel permanent. On the porch, a thick white envelope was taped to the doorframe. My hands were the ones that reached for it, though I didn't remember moving. The paper inside was a single note, written in Frank's neat script, with a bluntness that felt like an accusation. I'll handle things from here. Don't make this harder. No, please, no explanation. Just instruction, and that polite cruelty of someone who believes control excuses callousness. I sat down on the hood of my car, like a woman who had lost her footing on a familiar staircase. The engine idled. The air smelled of hot metal. My hands shook in a way I hadn't felt since the days after my husband went to the hospital for the last time, but the sound that escaped me wasn't a cry. It was a small, quiet thing. "Not again," I whispered, and the words were more to myself than to anyone else. There's a particular sorrow in being cleared out as if you were excess furniture. It's not just the belongings. It's the small erasures, the way someone can decide your place in the world for you. I looked at the boxes. A lamp with a chip in the base my grandson had made. The chipped bowl I used for my morning cereal. A stack of recipe cards stained with years of hands. They weren't valuable in a monetary sense, but they were the ledger of my life. Someone had bundled them up and made them transient. I sat there a long while, watching dust move in the slant of late sun across the drive. I let the trembling fingers slow and tried to name what I felt. Not just betrayal, but a recognition of a pattern that had perhaps always been there in thin lines, finally bold enough to see. My mind went to the hospital beds where I used to stand at night, the machines clicking and the world reduced to breath and rhythm. I thought about the recipes in my hands and the quilts and the paint on the railing I had just scrubbed. I thought about the way love sometimes can hide convenience, how people will conflate care with control. I called Rachel. She answered on the second ring. I heard the steady sound of a coffee machine in the background, and the distant clamor of city noise. "Mom," she said, and then the breath caught in her voice when she realized the tone. I told her, and I didn't skip any details. I told her about the locks, the boxes, the note. She swore softly, a small, fierce sound I loved, and said, "Mom, pack a bag. I'm coming." She was loud in the way daughters can be, practical and immediate, as if anger could be a rope thrown across a river. But I stopped her. I didn't want her to arrive in the middle of a scene. I wanted to gather facts, to steady my voice, to turn an emotional avalanche into a series of deliberate steps. "No," I said quietly. "Not yet. I need to breathe, Rachel. Go get the boys tonight. Come tomorrow morning. We'll do it together." She protested. Then she trusted me as I had trusted him. I could hear her worry, but she agreed. When I hung up, I felt a strange calm settle around the edges of my panic. I knew then that sitting in the car and whispering would not change anything. I also knew that the way forward would not be theater. It would be work. A slow, careful assembling of the truth. I had built a house. I had painted the railing until my knuckles were sore. I could build again, this time with a different tool set, the kind that uses lawyers and ledgers and patient footsteps rather than saws and nails. So I did what anyone with a stubborn heart would. I breathed, made myself a list, and began calling the people who could make a house an address again rather than a paper claim. I called a lawyer friend, then a friend at the bank who owed me a kindness from years before. I took photographs of the boxes and the locks, folded the note into an envelope, and put it into my bag. The small acts of paperwork felt like armor. That night, I slept not with the heaviness that crushes, but with the small steely thread of resolve weaving through me. The boxes were still on the porch in the morning. The locks glinted in the dawn like cold eyes. But I had a plan, and plans have a way of reshaping fear into movement. I walked up the steps, took a picture of the note, and put the photograph into my phone like evidence. Then I put my key into the neighbor's spare lockbox and walked away from the house I'd painted and back toward the life I had yet to reclaim. When Rachel and I walked into the legal aid office that morning, the waiting room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and coffee, the kind of ordinary scent that felt oddly brave in the moment. The woman who met us at the front desk had quick eyes and a folder full of Post-it notes, the kind of energy that said she'd been up late reading other people's troubles. We sat down across from each other, 3 generations in a small room, making a plan. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like the fog was lifting just enough to take a clear breath. Our attorney's name was Maya. She was in her 30s, decisive and direct in the way young lawyers are when they haven't yet learned to be gentle with bad news. She listened, really listened, as I told her the story. the paper trail, the note on the porch. When she reached for the folder and opened the papers Rachel had copied, I watched her face move through the small changes that I'd felt in myself. Surprise, concern, then professional focus. "We can help you," she said. It was simple and honest, and it felt like the first true sentence of the fight. We started slowly, the way any proper investigation must begin, by putting things in order. Maya asked me to show her every document I had, the loan applications, the checks I'd written, bank statements, the receipts from the contractor Frank had used. Rachel sorted through files in the spare room while I pulled out old envelopes from drawers. It felt like opening small windows in a house that had been closed too long. Each paper let in a sliver of light and a gust of what had been hidden. What surprised me most was how ordinary the evidence looked when it sat on the table. A bank transfer confirmation, an email from a supplier, a contractor receipt with my name next to the amount. The records didn't carry the weight of drama in themselves. They were quiet little anchors of truth, but side by side they told a story that was undeniable. Maya tapped a stack with a pen. "These transfers show funds moving from your account into building expenses," she said. 70% of the costs are traceable to your savings. That's significant, Claire. Saying the number out loud made something inside me settle. 70%, not complete, but more than enough to prove that I had been more than just a decorative partner. I had funded this house. I had bankrolled the dream that he'd called ours. It felt like a small, solid thing to hold. Maya didn't sugarcoat what came next. She explained the process: subpoena bank records, request contractor invoices from the companies that worked on the house, pull emails and texts. We needed witnesses, too. The suppliers who remembered depositing checks and the subcontractors who saw who paid. It was a list of small, sometimes tedious things, but each step was a doorway back into the life I'd had a right to keep. We began making calls. Rachel, who had always been good at brisk, necessary phone conversations, reached out to the supplier in Greenville. He remembered Frank. He'd even commented on how neat the invoices were, he said, then stopped and added, "You know, Mrs. Bennett, the checks that came in for that project were from a Claire Bennett account." It was a small confirmation, said with a hollowness like someone tasting stale coffee. Maya wrote it down carefully. The contractor who did the foundation answered slowly at first, then with a long sigh. "I remember Claire. She'd come by with coffee, paying us out of her purse sometimes. Frank handled most of the talking, but Mrs. Bennett, you were on the checks." He agreed to come in, if needed. The accounts built one by one, an ordinary ledger assembling into proof. Frank's reaction surprised me in the way it exposed character. He refused to mediate, saying he had nothing to gain from drawing things out. He told Maya he would settle quietly, that this was a misunderstanding blown up by drama. His voice on the phone had been calm, almost smooth, until Maya asked her first pointed question about the title paperwork and whose idea it was to handle the mortgage for convenience. There was a crack then, a quick sharp sound like a plate dropped behind a door. He hung up. When the day of the deposition came, he arrived in a crisp shirt, as if he were heading to one of his construction meetings. He answered questions with a practiced ease, deflecting the small things with larger gestures and history. "We planned this together," he'd say. "Claire signed the forms." But there were pauses between his sentences, hesitations that leaked when Maya showed the chain of bank transfers and the emails that directed supplier payments from my account. A careful tone from a young lawyer can make the truth feel heavy. It can make the light in someone's voice go thin. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. People moved in deliberate ways. My heart hummed like a small engine as I sat with Rachel beside me, fingers folded tight in my lap. Maya was calm, the rustle of her papers the kind of music I'd come to trust. The judge, a woman with soft eyes and decades of courthouse steel behind them, listened as Maya laid out the case, the funds, the receipts, the manipulation of documents that suggested a pattern rather than an accident. When Maya spoke about the transfers, she didn't scream or pound a table. She narrated what was plain: dates, amounts, accounts, signatures. She showed the judge the checks, the email threads where Frank had promised suppliers he'd handle billing, and then presented the note taped to the porch as a symptom of control rather than an argument over space. She read a line from a supplier's testimony. Mrs. Bennett was present on site and paid by check on multiple occasions. The room felt airtight with fact. The truth was patient. Frank's attorney tried to make the story smaller. "Conversations are informal," he said. "Mistakes happen." My client had every intention of fixing any clerical errors. The language was measured, polite, but words like clerical errors are thin when stacked against a bank ledger and contractor checks. The judge, who had the patience of someone who'd seen all kinds of human folly, asked direct questions. Where were the forms filed? Who signed which documents for the mortgage? Why is there no record of Mrs. Bennett on the title when her payments are so clear? The questions were plain and struck like small hammers. At one point, the judge looked at me directly. She didn't shout or lecture. She just said, "Mrs. Bennett, tell us in your own words what you understand to have happened." I told the story as simply as I could. The paint on the porch, the nights I spent picking curtains, the way Frank had promised to keep us both safe. I told them about the letter taped to the door, the boxes on the porch, the disbelief when Rachel ran her finger down the deed. The retelling wasn't for drama. It was a map. Court is a peculiar place. The air hangs heavy with officialdom, and yet it can be the most truthful place of all. Evidence doesn't have to sparkle to be convincing. It only has to be consistent. Maya laid out the transfers. She put up the emails. She called witnesses who confirmed seeing me hand checks and sign approvals for materials. The supplier who'd spoken on the phone came in and described a transaction. The contractor testified about invoices written to my account, and a closing agent explained how certain documents are filed, and how it surprised her not to find a spouse or co-borrower listed when the funds came from another account. Facing the truth, Frank's composure cracked in small ways. He argued at times, blamed poor record-keeping, and insisted on the informality of trust between two people building a life together. But trust, the judge observed in a quiet voice that cut through excuses, does not replace legal responsibility. "There is a difference," she said, "between what two people feel and what two people sign." She spoke gently about elder exploitation, and about how someone might use the veneer of care to cover financial control. The words landed like a verdict in waiting. When the judge read her findings, I felt the room tilt like a boat catching a favorable wind. She found that the majority of payments for the property had come from my accounts, and that the title's exclusive listing in Frank's name, combined with the behavior that capped with a note on a door, amounted to elder financial exploitation under the statutes she cited. It's one thing to hear the legal phrase. It's another to feel it confirm what you already suspected in your bones, that you had been taken from in a way that hurt beyond the wallet. The judge ordered restitution and the correction of the title. My name, my actual legal name, was to be recorded as owner, and the court placed conditions to reimburse me for certain expenses. There was a process to the ruling, papers to be filed and signatures to be witnessed, but when she said the words, "The court rules in favor of Claire Bennett," my knees felt like sunlight breaking through on a winter day, warmth where there had been frost. Frank left the courtroom with his head low. He didn't argue further. The weight of the documents and witnesses had made more noise than his polished explanations. He was angry in a way that didn't surprise me. Angry not because he'd been exposed, but because he'd been unmasked in a place that respected facts over charm. The walk back to my car with Rachel after the hearing felt like a slow parade. We didn't clamor with joy. There was a quietness to it, a stilling. We stopped at a little cafe on the way home and shared a slice of pie. We didn't speak much. We watched people go by through the window, ordinary lives humming, and we let the normalcy soothe the nervous edges of the day. There were practical things to do in the days that followed. The papers had to be recorded, signatures witnessed, accounts updated. People I'd called earlier, the supplier, the contractor, my friend at the bank, helped in small, concrete ways, signing affidavits, confirming dates, turning memory into proof. It was tedious and kind of miraculous, like watching a house slowly rebuilt after a storm, plank by plank, bracket by bracket. When I finally stepped back onto my porch with the corrected title in my hand, my name printed plainly where it belonged, I felt an odd mixture of relief and residual sorrow. Relief because the house was legally mine again. Sorrow because so much had been taken before I even realized. But the sorrow felt different now. It had edges, and those edges were lined with action and accountability. That night, I sat in the same rocking chair where I had once watched fog move across the lake and held the paperwork like a small talisman. I ran my thumb along the embossed letters of my name and let the quiet settle. The house smelled of lemon cleaner and wood polish, the same ordinary scents as the office where the fight began. Only now the ordinary had been reclaimed. Only now the home felt like something I had to protect. Not because it was made of planks and paint, but because it held pieces of my life that no one had the right to take. There was more to come. I knew that. Rebuilding trust and repairing the emotional damage would take longer than any court order. But the judge's voice, calm, measured, just, had given me something I needed. A formal reckoning that said I mattered, that my resources and my decisions had weight. I had gone to the courthouse not to make a scene, but to ask for what was mine. The court answered. Now the work of living in the wake of that answer could begin. When I first turned the key in the new lock, the sound it made was soft but sure, a small click that echoed louder in my heart than it did in the quiet of the porch. The brass was still shiny from the hardware store, warm beneath my fingers. I stood there for a moment before pushing the door open, my reflection faintly visible in the glass pane. I looked older, yes, but also clearer, like time had polished me down to something honest. The door creaked just slightly, the way it always had, and that tiny, familiar sound felt like the house exhaling, welcoming me home. I stepped inside and took it in slowly. Dust had settled where boxes once sat. Sunlight stretched across the wooden floor in long, peaceful ribbons, and the faint scent of cedar from the walls lingered in the air. It wasn't grand. It wasn't new anymore, but it was mine, completely, legally, spiritually mine. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was no "we" written into the space, no uncertain promise waiting to break. Just me, just my home. The first thing I did that day was open every single window. Fresh air rolled through the rooms, soft and cool, rustling the curtains like a quiet applause. The lake shimmered in the distance through the back window, the same view that had once made me believe in the idea of forever. I stood there for a while, watching the ripples move across the water, and I realized I didn't need forever to look the same anymore. I only needed peace. I spent that afternoon changing the locks myself, one door at a time. Rachel had offered to hire someone, but I'd told her no. I wanted to do it with my own hands. There was something healing about it. The precision of the screwdriver, the weight of the metal, the simple satisfaction of hearing each bolt slide into place. It wasn't about keeping someone out. It was about closing the space that had been open to betrayal and turning it into one that could hold safety again. After that, I hung new curtains. Nothing fancy, just soft cream ones that caught the light the way morning mist does. I took down the old frames that held photos of shared dreams and replaced them with pictures of Rachel, the boys, and a few snapshots from my own younger days. I found a small frame that had once held a wedding photo of Frank and me. I replaced it with a pressed wildflower instead. Something delicate, something that had survived on its own. Out on the porch, I planted a row of wildflowers along the rail. It felt right, a mix of colors and shapes that didn't need permission to bloom. I'd learned enough about soil and sunlight from my husband years ago to know what would take root and what wouldn't. As I knelt down, I could feel the earth giving a little beneath my fingers, like it was letting me start over. Each seed felt like a word whispered into the ground. Still here. Still mine, still growing. The days that followed were quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. The silence no longer felt hollow. It had shape and warmth now, the kind that fills a space without noise. I woke up early, opened the windows, and brewed coffee in the same chipped mug I'd found in one of those boxes he'd left behind. I drank it on the porch with my feet tucked beneath me, the light spilling across the lake. The world looked softer, slower, like it had finally decided to match my pace. Rachel came by often, her visits full of small joys. She'd bring the boys, and they'd run across the yard chasing dragonflies, laughing like nothing bad had ever happened in this place. The house, once the scene of heartbreak, started to sound like home again. I remember one evening, she stood beside me on the porch watching the boys toss pebbles into the water. "You know," she said, "you could sell this place, move closer to us." I smiled at her. "No," I said gently. "I think I'll stay. I built this home twice, once with love and once with strength. The second time means more." She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. She understood. It was on one of those afternoons, golden light spilling through the trees, a quiet breeze curling around the porch, that Rachel turned to me and asked, "Mom, do you regret any of it?" I thought about that for a while. I thought about the porch we'd painted, the nights I'd spent dreaming of forever, and the way betrayal had cracked something I once believed couldn't break. "I regret trusting someone who didn't know what to do with it," I said finally. "But I don't regret loving. I don't regret believing, because those things, they made me build this home, even if I had to rebuild it again later. Sometimes love starts the foundation, but strength finishes the walls." She smiled then, that quiet, knowing smile daughters give their mothers when they finally see them as human. "I think you're stronger than you've ever been," she said. "I think I finally know what that word really means," I replied. After she left that evening, I sat out on the porch long after the sun went down. The air cooled as the lake turned to glass. Fireflies blinked near the steps, and the lamp beside me hummed softly, casting a golden glow across the rail where the wildflowers had begun to bloom. I could hear crickets, the faint echo of laughter from a neighbor's yard, and the gentle rhythm of my own breathing. I thought about everything that had led here. The trust, the betrayal, the courtroom, the papers with my name finally restored. It wasn't revenge that had brought me peace. It was reclaiming myself piece by piece, until I could look in the mirror and recognize the woman staring back. The woman who had once whispered, "Not again," now sat in a house that was entirely hers, a house where no one could ever erase her name. I took a sip of coffee and let the warmth sit on my tongue. "I thought forever meant someone staying," I whispered to the night. "Turns out, it means me standing." The lake reflected the last light of dusk, the sky bleeding from soft orange into blue. I felt my husband in the quiet, not in the ache of loss anymore, but in the strength he'd once admired in me. He'd always said I had a kind of steady courage, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Maybe this was what he meant. The months rolled on gently after that. I started volunteering at the local library again, teaching seniors how to manage online accounts, how to recognize scams, how to protect what's theirs. Some came with stories like mine, soft-spoken women who'd trusted too much, too long. I'd sit with them, help them fill out forms, and sometimes, when the room went quiet, I'd tell them softly, "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't fighting back. It's believing you still deserve to." They always looked up at me the same way I once looked at my reflection. Tired, uncertain, but slowly waking up to their own worth. I began writing small notes to myself each morning and pinning them to the fridge. Some days they said, "Keep what's yours." Other days, "Grow what's left." Little reminders that even when love fails you, life doesn't have to. By spring, the wildflowers had spread thick and bright along the porch rail. Reds, yellows, soft purples, their petals catching the sun just right. The garden had become a small miracle, It was wild and unplanned, the kind of beauty that doesn't need symmetry or permission. Every time I looked at it, I thought, this is what healing looks like. A little messy, a little unexpected, but growing anyway. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sky burn gold, Rachel called. She said the boys had been talking about Grandma's lake house all week and wanted to visit again. I told her to come any time, that the house was always open to them. But when I hung up, I realized what a gift that sentence had become. The house was open, not to people who would take from it, but to those who filled it with laughter, trust, and love. As the sun slipped behind the trees, I leaned back in my chair and let the warmth of the fading light touch my face. The air smelled of wildflowers and fresh paint. My hands wrapped around my coffee cup, steady and sure. I whispered my closing thought more to myself than to the world. Sometimes love doesn't build your home. Strength does. And this time, my name's the only one that needs to be on it. The camera would linger here if this were a film. The stillness of the lake, the softness of the sunset, the gentle lines of an older woman who's no longer waiting to be rescued. The world would fade to quiet, not because the story ended, but because it had finally found peace. If you've ever lost something you built, a home, a dream, a part of yourself, I hope this story reminds you it's never too late to take it back. To rebuild, not for revenge, but for the simple dignity of your own peace. If this story touched you, take a moment, like, share, or subscribe. Not for me, but for the stories that need to be told. The quiet ones, the real ones, the ones that remind us that even after everything, strength can still bloom again.